Senate Majority Leader.
Ask consent to call the quorum be terminated.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I also ask unanimous consent because of the time delay here that the recess not start until 1 o'clock rather than 12:30 today. I ask consent.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I appreciate very much the courtesy of my two friends, the distinguished senator from New Mexico, Mr. Udall, and my dear friend from Oregon, Mr. Merkley, for being understanding. We had some word changes, and, you know, we're all get tied up on words, and so Senator McConnell and I had to work that out this morning, and we were able to get that done just now. So I appreciate very much your always very thoughtfulness and so easy to work with. Mr. President, our ability to debate and deliberate without the restraints of time limits is central and unique to the United States Senate. It's supposed to be that way. It's in our DNA. It's one of the many traits intentionally designed to distinguish this body from the House of Representatives and from every other legislative body in the world. It's always been central to the Senate, and it should be. But when that arrangement is abused, we have to do something. We have to act because when abuses keep us from doing our work, they deter us from working together, and they stop us from working for the American people. And within these four walls, it degrades the relationship that make the Senate run. What's special about the Senate is that this body operates by consensus. It runs on a fuel made of comedy and trust. When abuses happen or when colleagues act in bad faith, it dilutes and degrades that fuel, and the Senate stalls. There are nearly as many opinions on what to do about the Senate as there are senators. Senators Harkin, Udall of New Mexico, and Merkley have listened to many ideas and have worked to find solutions. I thank them for their time, efforts, and energy. So have Senators Schumer and Alexander. No one has worked harder than they have to find a way out of this crisis, and I admire and appreciate their efforts. Leader McConnell and I have worked alongside all of them and with each other to find common ground. In the spirit of compromise that we're trying to restore to the Senate, this is how we have agreed. As to secret holes, first, we have to get rid of secret holes. Last year, a single senator held up 70 nominations. Why? Some parochial issue in his state that had nothing to do with what we were trying to do here in approving nominations. The standoff finally ended, but only after it became public. What he did was within his right, but it wasn't the right thing to do, and the rule has to be changed. Senators will no longer be able to hide, and the light of day will shine harder on the Senate as a body. I thank Senators Wyden, Grassley, and McCaskill for their leadership on this subject. About nominations, Mr. President. We have to recognize that public servants are not political pawns. An appointment by the President to a federal agency is a great honor. In recent years, it has become a sentence to purgatory. The Senate no longer officially performs our constitutional duty of confirming nominees. That leaves important offices without leaders, leaves important duties unfulfilled, and unfairly leaves in limbo well-qualified nominees. The Senate is responsible for confirming about 300 nominees to part-time boards and commissions. Every one of these boards and commissions require the approval of the Senate. Because of that, the vetting process for these boards and commissions takes an inordinate amount of time. They spend as much time the FBI does and the other people do the background checks on these part-time jobs than they do somebody that's going to become an assistant secretary or a judge. And it just eats up time that's unnecessary. There is no reason for senators to keep them from their posts, but that's exactly what happens. And it's not always the fault of the senators. We have to get rid of as many of these nominations as we can. And that's what the Rules Committee leadership has recommended. Senator Schumer, the chairman, Senator Alexander, the ranking member, have come up with something I think is so very important. They're going to help us get rid of about a third of these nominations, not only these to to part-time boards and commissions, but others. And this will be, well, the process needs to be changed. So we'll work to cut by about a third the number of executive nominations that require Senate approval. Senator Schumer and Alexander, as I've indicated, are the leaders in this as far as what we've done to this point. But this legislation will be turned over, and they'll be working with Senators Lieberman and Collins, who are the Committee of Jurisdiction at this stage, to develop legislation that will do exactly what I've outlined. Third, we can't afford to waste time for the sake of wasting time. One of the minority's favorite tactics has been to force or threaten to force the clerks to read to read amendments. Now, Madam President, you'll note here I said one of the minority's favorite tactics has been to force or threaten to force the clerks to read amendments. I didn't say one of the Republicans' favorite tactics has been to force or to threaten to force the clerks to read amendments. We've all threatened to do it, and it's wrong, and it's got to stop. That's what we're going to do here later today. This is nothing short of showmanship to have these amendments read, and in this day and age, almost always totally unnecessary. In the 18th and 19th centuries of the United States Senate, senators' offices were this desk. That's all they had. They didn't have offices like we have. Their offices were right here on the Senate floor. So hearing the clerk read aloud a bill probably was more essential then. That's an understatement, because it was part of the debate. Today, that's no longer the case. During the health reform debate 2 Decembers ago, while snow covered Washington and Christmas neared, opponents of the bill worked hard to delay its inevitable passage. On a Saturday toward the end of the debate, the minority forced the nonpartisan Senate clerks to read the entirety of an important amendment to the bill. The reading started just before 8:30 a.m. and lasted until just before 4 p.m. in the afternoon. 7 hours of time during which nobody listened to the reading of the bill. Everyone had already studied it. It had been filed a long time before, and it was after each senator had already decided how he or she would vote anyway. We don't have time for these kind of gratuitous delays. So the third change we'll make is this. If an amendment has already been filed, a senator cannot force its reading. Finally, as to what we call around here, some of this inside politics, motions to proceed and filling the tree. Let me talk a little bit about these two items. I've often expressed my concerns about the procedural hurdle of forcing a preliminary vote simply to determine whether we can have a second vote, determine whether we can debate a bill, the vote called cloture on the motion to proceed. It's another one of the most commonly used tactics deployed simply to frustrate progress and waste time. Last Congress, we had 26 cloture votes on motions to proceed. Most all of them were bills that weren't controversial. We had to hold a vote on whether to hold a vote on whether to debate a bill to promote tourism coming to our country. It's called the Travel Promotion Act. After wasting days of precious time, it passed 90-3. We had to jump through the same hoops before we could vote on extending emergency unemployment benefits, which passed by 87 votes, and before we could vote on letting the FDA regulate tobacco, which passed with 84 votes, and before we could vote on updating our food safety laws for the first time in a century, which passed with 75% of the Senate. Democrats are bothered by how often Republicans have forced procedural votes like those on cloture on the motion to proceed. I know Republicans are equally frustrated with me for filling the amendment tree on occasion. And their argument is, and they're right, it prevents amendments from being offered. So this agreement that Leader McConnell and I have reached is going to clean up a lot of this. Just as I will exercise restraint in using my right as Majority Leader to fill the amendment tree, he and his Republican conference will curtail their habit of filibustering the motion to proceed. Both parties this should be the exception rather than the rule, and starting now they will be. Senator McConnell and I have prepared a colloquy reflecting our agreement on these provisions. I ask consent that be entered in the record as if read live.
Without objection.
So let me conclude, Madam President. Again, expressing my appreciation to those parties who have been so heavily involved in this. Udall, Merkley, Harkin, of course my friend from Tennessee, Lamar Alexander, Chuck Schumer, but especially I want to express my appreciation to the Republican leader. As we have said on this floor lots of times, most all that the American public sees us doing is fighting. We're here arguing on behalf of a senator on our side or a problem we have on our side. But much of the work done in this body is done with Senator McConnell and I in my office or his office trying to work through some of these problems. They take a lot of time, and they take our patience and the patience of the entire Senate. And that's why I started here with my remarks this morning, telling everyone I appreciate their understanding that we're trying to work things out. We've been working on this for a long, long time. These changes are important, and I really appreciate my friend, the Republican leader, for his attitude in all this, recognizing that we have to make some progress here. The changes we'll agree to today are, first, ending secret holds, second, reducing by about one-third the number of executive nominations that are subject to Senate delays, third, ending the time-consuming practice of reading aloud amendments that have been publicly available for 3 days, fourth, limiting the use of filibuster as a motion to proceed, and fifth, filling the amendment tree only when necessary. I know some want us to go even further. There are just as many arguments for not going so far. But remember this, we're making these changes in the name of compromise. And this agreement itself was constructed with the same respect for mutual concession. Senator McConnell and I both believe that our reverence for this institution must always be more important than our respective political parties. And as part of this compromise, we've agreed that I won't force a majority vote to fundamentally change the Senate. That is the so-called constitutional option, and he won't in the future. The 5 reforms we're making, however, are very, very significant. They'll move us 5 steps closer to a healthier Senate. In the minds of many, not far enough. In the minds of some, too far. But that's what the Senate's all about. It's about compromise, consensus building. Yes, we want the Senate to move deliberately, but we want it to move. We have to find a balance that encourages us to debate, but also enables us to legislate. We're governed by a delicate mix of rules, rights, and responsibilities in this body. To that mix, we need to add respect. The Senate should function as the founders intended it to function and as the country needs it to function, not simply as slowly as its rules will allow it to function. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
The Republican leader.
The colloquy which the Majority Leader and I are working on at the moment will reflect the entirety of our understanding. But with regard to comments about how we got to this place, let me just say first to my good friend from Nevada, on several occasions heard both him and the President of the United States talk about how much was accomplished in the last Congress, so I'm often perplexed as to which was the case. Either the extraordinary amount of legislation was passed and signed, or the Senate was obstructing. One or the other, they couldn't both be true, and I suspect that the real view that most historians will have is that the last Congress passed a great deal of very significant legislation, and then we had a referendum on that November 2nd, and the American people changed the equation. But without getting back into that or a litany of complaints by the minority, the Senate has heard them before. The principal complaint the minority's had over the last 2 years, the number of times the tree has been filled up and we've been unable to offer amendments. We're all aware of our grievances on both sides, but as is often the case in the Senate, we've worked together through Senator Alexander and Senator Schumer to come to an agreement as to how the Senate will go forward, the procedures that will be employed. And we'll have votes later consistent with the precedents of the Senate at the thresholds that are required under Senate rules. And then we will move on with the people's business. And I'm optimistic that my good friend, the Majority Leader, and I can convince our colleagues that we ought to get back to operating the way the Senate did as recently as 3 or 4 years ago, when bills came up and they were open for amendment and we voted on amendments, and at some point the bill would be completed. I know that we can do that. I think it's the right way for the Senate to operate. And I want to thank my friend, the Majority Leader, for his leadership in working through this difficult period of rules consideration. And I would say to my colleagues, again, in closing, that the colloquy which we will insert in the record will reflect the entirety of our understanding as to how we go forward, and then we'll have the votes later, which will give the Senate a chance to go on record about some changes that have been agreed to and some that are being proposed that are not agreed to. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from New York.
First, let me thank both our leader, Harry Reid, and our minority leader, Mitch McConnell, for their leadership and guidance. They're walking out together, and that's a good metaphor for what has happened here today. I want to thank my colleague Lamar Alexander as well, who, under the two leaders' authorization, we talked and, of course, in constant touch with them, worked out this agreement. So I rise to speak in support of the bipartisan agreement on Senate rules reform. It's an important step forward in changing the way we do business here in the Senate. Last year, the Rules Committee held 6 hearings on the filibuster. They talked about the history of the filibuster and what had happened and how it had gone out of control. Those hearings were requested, actually, by a member of the Rules Committee, Tom Udall, the senator from New Mexico, and it's why we embarked on the hearings, and I very much appreciate his suggestion that we do that. At the hearings, Democrats brought up that the majority was no longer able to move forward to consider bills by filibusters on motions to proceed. And Republicans argued that they were too often blocked from offering amendments by the majority filling the tree. Both sides had legitimate complaints. What couldn't be disputed that was, in many ways, the Senate was broken. It had become harder and harder for the body to consider, debate, and decide legislation and nominations that it's supposed to take care of. It is true, as Senator McConnell said, that we had a very productive session. But that didn't gainsay the fact that there were 74 filibusters, that many issues that should have been decided weren't decided, and that the Senate seemed to many to not be functioning in the way it used to, where debate was stifled by both the majority and the minority. And so when we resolved things. Now, when I first came to the Senate 12 years ago, a senior senator pulled me aside and said, the role of the majority is to set the agenda. They put bills on the floor and they're debated. And the role of the minority is to offer amendments, to change them. We're not doing that much anymore. What usually happens is we offer a bill and the minority says, we don't want it. Now, they say we don't want it because we've refused to allow unlimited amendments. We think they don't want it because they may want to just gum up the Senate. But whatever the reason, both sides have legitimate complaints here, and we're trying to resolve some of those. So clearly, the time for change has come. I believe the reforms we're adopting today give us a very good chance to go back to the way of operating, where we have real debate on bills and amendments and votes on bills and amendments. It won't happen overnight, and both sides will still use the procedural tools available to them on the most important issues. But we hope it will work well enough and get us back on track. Leaders Reid and McConnell, in the colloquy that they would put forward, that Senator Alexander and I participated in framing, will do 2 things in addition to the changes that we will make. One, each will say that we should use the motion to proceed to block bills from coming to the floor infrequently, and the majority will say we should use filling the tree to block amendments that might come forward on those bills infrequently. Obviously, we're going to have to watch how this works over the next several months. And obviously, there will be times when each side decides they have to use the right that the Senate gives them to block things. But the presumption will be that in the usual course of business, we will not do that, that they will be the exception, not the rule. A second thing that will be stated by both leaders is who's ever in the majority next Congress will not try to change the rules by simple majority, this Congress or next. Some on our side were worried that if we didn't try to invoke the constitutional option, should the other side get the majority, I don't personally think we have to worry about that, or that'll happen anyway, but should that happen, then they might invoke it and do something else, so why not do it now? Well, both leaders have agreed that they will not do that, and without the leaders' support, it's virtually impossible for it to get done. So that's a significant change that when the colloquy is printed in the record, we will see both leaders have agreed to. And I want to thank them for providing strong leadership and guidance throughout this process. I became convinced, working with my good friend, the senator from Tennessee, and having conversations, plenty with my friend and leader, Harry Reid, and a few with Senator McConnell, that everybody wanted to come to an agreement here. Everyone wanted to see the Senate work better. And that made me feel pretty good that, of what we did here. Second, I want to recognize the many senators from my party that worked tirelessly to create the momentum for change. And at the top of the list, of course, are Tom Udall, Jeff Merkley, and Tom Harkin. They worked very hard on these issues. They knew, two of them newer in the Senate, freshmen, one who has much more experience than I do in the Senate, Senator Harkin, worked really hard to see that we changed the rules. And while the changes aren't everything they would have liked or I would have liked, certainly the changes we're getting, not insignificant at all, are because Tom Udall started pushing this idea when he got here to the Senate. I think his predecessor, Clinton Anderson, had done some of this. And Jeff Merkley and Tom Harkin joined in the cause early on and brought us actually to the point where the inertia of not doing anything would no longer govern, and we would get together and get something done. There were other senators who played a very important role. Senator Lautenberg and his proposals, Michael Bennet, Mark Udall, Al Franken, all had proposals and all played a very significant role here and can feel very good about the changes we have wrought. And I particularly want to thank Senator Klobuchar for leading the working group of senators who spent hours reviewing and refining. Without all of them, I don't think the agreement would have been possible. Now, I'd make one other point, and this is a disappointment to me, and I'll just make it myself. One idea championed by the reform-minded senators that I thought made eminent sense is the talking filibuster. It didn't change the balance in the Senate. It simply said that if you were going to filibuster, you had to stay on the floor and talk. You couldn't just be there and object. The American public understands that when a senator wants to filibuster a bill, that senator should be required to stand up and talk on the Senate floor. I strongly support the talking filibuster. We sometimes call it the Jimmy Stewart talking filibuster because everyone knows the movie. And I believe that it would pull back the curtain on the kind of filibusters we have now. We wouldn't change the rule of 60, but the filibustering senator and his supporters right now don't even have to show up or talk for a vote. This talking filibuster is one change I hope the Senate will adopt in the future because it makes good sense and we should do it. I don't believe we should eliminate the filibuster altogether, but we need to make it real. The talking filibuster proposals would do that, and I hope someday we'll make the talking filibuster part of the Senate rules, and I will vote for that resolution that will be on the floor later today. Of course, it will need 2/3 to pass. Finally, I really want to thank Senator Alexander. He and I have been friends before this, but we really worked together throughout the holidays, vacations, recesses, and being here. And he was creative, he was flexible, as always, he was genial, and as usual, he was smart. And his concern for this institution helped bring the minority and majority together, and I very much appreciate Senator Alexander's role. Now, Senator Reid outlined the other parts of the bipartisan proposal, the end to secret holds, which will be done by rule, the end of reading of amendments filed for at least 72 hours, also done by rule, and the third proposal to limit the number of executive nominations. There are so many, about 30% of the total, that we propose to eliminate. He and I and Senators Lieberman and Collins, who have the jurisdiction in their committee, will introduce a bill, and we hope to move it quickly. We have gotten the agreement from the House that they will move the bill, and we should eliminate confirmation on so many of these positions that really shouldn't require confirmation. Members of part-time boards and commissions, officials who handle legislative or public affairs, things like that. And I want to thank Senators Lieberman and Collins for that. Finally, let me say in conclusion, as chairman of the Rules Committee, I believe there's more we can do. I want to see our efforts at reform continue. I'd like to continue working on the streamlining of confirmation of nominations, both executive and judicial, and our Rules Committee will continue to look at that. Change doesn't come easy. In conclusion, Madam President, change doesn't come often or easily to the Senate. But we're here because many members worked hard on reform. And both parties, continuing with the tradition of feeling of bipartisanship that began in the lame duck and I think has continued through the State of the Union speech, is continuing again today. I hope our efforts will make a difference. I hope the Senate will function better, and I am very hopeful that with these changes, both formal and informal, they will. We know there are still sharp differences within our body on issues, and those won't disappear. On certain bills, both sides will use every procedural tactic that makes the Senate a different body than the House. But hopefully on most we won't. In conclusion, while those of us who wanted reform in the Senate didn't get everything we wanted, the Senate will be a significantly better place for the changes we are enacting. As a result of this agreement, there should be more debate, more votes, fewer items blocked by a single senator or a small minority of senators. Make no mistake about it, this agreement is not a panacea, but it's a very significant step on the road to making the Senate function in a better, fairer way. And again, I thank all of my colleagues who participated in this.
Madam President.
The Senator from Tennessee.
Madam President, I would like to thank the Senator from New York and the Senator from New Mexico and Oregon and Senator Harkin of Iowa for their efforts, some over many years, to achieve two goals: to help make the Senate a place that is better able to deal with the serious business that comes before us, and second, to preserve the Senate as a unique forum, unique in the world really, as a legislative body in its protection of minority rights. This is an important step forward. The reform of the Senate, but the reform the Senate really needs is a change in behavior, not in its rules. These rules move us in the right direction. The behavior that the Senator from New York spoke about and that the Majority Leader and the Minority Leader spoke about is what in the end will really make the most difference. I've talked with many senators on both sides of the aisle. We've done a lot of talking, both on the floor here and off the floor, about where the Senate is today. And a great many of us feel the Senate really is a shadow of itself, shadow of its former self, in terms of its ability to function as a truly deliberative body. It is hard to see how the majority can complain after a legislative session where they passed health care legislation and financial reform legislation and other legislation that may have even resulted in a diminishing of their numbers. They had a productive, from their point of view, session. But the truth is, on both sides of the aisle, we would like to see the Senate function in a different way. The Majority Leader and Republican Leader have put out in a colloquy what that way is, and that will govern what we do. But basically, I believe it is this. We want the same thing: a Senate where most bills are considered by committee, where most bills come to the floor as a result of bipartisan cooperation, where most bills are then debated and amended and then voted upon. To someone who just tuned into the United States Senate, you may say, well, that's a very simple solution. I thought that's what the Senate was supposed to be. It is what the Senate is supposed to be. And it wasn't so long ago that it was the standard operating procedure. Senator McConnell said it was just a few years ago. He and Senator Reid have both been here a number of years. I remember watching the Senate, and I've mentioned this before in this debate, between 1977 and 1985 when Howard Baker of Tennessee and Robert Byrd of West Virginia were the Republican and Democratic leaders. I had worked for Senator Baker before that as a legislative assistant. I knew Senator Byrd. Here's what went on then, and here's what could go on today. Most pieces of legislation that came to the floor started in committee. That gave us a chance to see what they really did, to improve them, to hear from voices from all over the country. Then that legislation came to the floor. During Senator Baker's day, when he was the majority leader, he wouldn't even bring a bill to the floor unless both the Republican chairman and the Democratic ranking member supported it, because he didn't want to waste the Senate's time. And he knew that with a 60-vote requirement in the Senate, that requirement forces consensus. See, people talk about the filibuster, but what we really have is a requirement that most important bills get 60 votes. And if you're sitting with 53 Democrats and 47 Republicans, you don't have to have an advanced degree in mathematics to figure out that if you don't have some Democrats and some Republicans, you don't get to 60. So Senator Baker was saying back in the 80s, bring the bill to the floor if it has the Republican chairman and the Democratic ranking member. Then the call would go out for amendments, and sometimes, Madam President, there would be 300 amendments. The senator from North Carolina or Tennessee might offer 40. And no one said, whoa, stop, you can't do that. Bring them on in. Sometimes there'd be 300 amendments. Then Senator Baker or Senator Byrd would ask for unanimous consent to close off amendments. Well, I guess because the senators by that time were exhausted from writing amendments, they all agreed to it, and then they started voting. Now, it got to be Wednesday or Thursday, and the party secretaries would go to the senators and they'd say, I notice you still have 30 amendments waiting. Maybe you'd only like to offer 15. Might get to Friday, and they'd say, I notice you have 5 left. Maybe you'd only like to have 1. But if they had one that they wanted to get, they almost always got the amendment, Madam President. And that's what this real importance of this agreement is today. The difference of opinion we've had that has caused us to degenerate in some cases to a body that didn't function as well as it should has been because on that side of the aisle, the majority, people didn't want to vote. It's like joining the Grand Ole Opry and saying, I don't want to sing. Some Republican senator might offer an amendment that side doesn't want to vote on, and they say, well, we don't want to vote. Or they say, well, we don't want to work on Friday, and so they go home. And they put pressure on the majority leader to use a procedure called filling the tree, which cuts off votes and the right to amend. Majority leader used that power to cut off all amendments in debate 44 times, more than the last 6 majority leaders combined. Then what happens over here? Well, then Republican senators, now in the minority, say, well, if we're not going to get amendments, we're going to start objecting. And so we have what's called a lot of filibusters. We say, you're counting filibusters when you cut off our right to offer amendments. They say, you guys over there are keeping us from doing our business. And on both sides, there's some truth to what has been said. So I think most senators are happy with this result. I think they will be. I hope that it works. I mean, the idea would be that the leaders will do their best to see that most bills go to committee, come to the floor, and that when they do, if the senator from North Carolina has an amendment that the senator from Tennessee would rather not vote on, she offers it anyway, if she wants to. Or if I have one she'd rather not vote on, I may offer it anyway, because it's important to the people of my state, even though we might be in a political minority at the moment. And I believe that if in most cases, most senators in the minority have that opportunity, that will help us get back to the kind of Senate that we want to see. Now, I would like to compliment Senator Udall and Senator Merkley and Senator Harkin. I learned a long time ago in life that if you start out in one direction, you don't always get exactly where you want to go, but you don't get anywhere if you don't start out. And I think what they have done with their intelligence and diligence and persistence in this have created a period of time here where the Senate is taking some steps today that will help the people of this country know that serious issues, and we've got plenty of them. The debt, for example, 42 cents out of every dollar we spend is borrowed. Jobs, for example, in my state, we've had 24 months of 9% unemployment. These changes will help us deal better with those issues. I will have more opportunity to talk about those after lunch later this afternoon. I want my friends on the other side to have a chance to make their points before we adjourn for or take a recess for an hour. But fundamentally, the steps we're taking make a difference. The one I'm especially glad to see is the effort to make it easier for a president, any president, to staff his or her government. One of the problems, and Senator Reid talked about, is we confirm too many people. It's not necessary for us to confirm the PR officer for a minor department. There's no need for that. The Secretary needs to go ahead and be able to appoint that person, and we need to be able to work on more important issues. And then secondly, we've created a phenomenon in this town that I refer to as innocent until nominated. We've created a situation where any citizen who's invited by the President to serve in his government has to run such a gauntlet that it's almost impossible to get through the end of the gauntlet without being branded as a criminal. I mean, and the reason is we have a maze of conflicting forms in the executive branch, plus an IRS audit, and a maze of conflicting forms in the Senate. And it not only delays, but it traps people, and it tricks people into filling out one definition of income here and another one here. We all know this is true. We all know it needs to be fixed. Now, we've tried to fix it before, not just some of us. The majority leader and the Republican leader tried to fix it, and they didn't get it done. Senator Lieberman and Senator Collins tried to fix it, and they couldn't get it done. 2 years ago, at a bipartisan breakfast which Senator Lieberman and I hosted, we had a whole group of us that said, let's try to get this done. We talked to President Obama's administration about it. They said, sure, go ahead. We'd like to see that happen, either for us or for the President after the next term. But we couldn't get it done because of resistance in this body to giving up any sort of power. Well, right now, Madam President, we have a unique confluence of support for the idea of making it easier for any president to staff his or her government. The majority leader and the Republican leader are solidly behind the effort. Senator Lieberman and Senator Collins are solidly behind the effort. Senator Schumer and I are working on a bill to do that, and we hope we can succeed. And this opportunity, this window, would not have happened if it hadn't been for the work of the senators who have been arguing for reforms. The other step we're likely to take is abolishing of the secret hold. I think that's a good idea. I speak from experience. When I was nominated by the first President Bush to be Education Secretary, the senator put a hold on my name. It took 3 months to get it off. I finally found out who it was. I never knew exactly why he did it or why he took it off. But it might help if I'd known it a little earlier. So I think it's a good idea. The majority leader put a hold on my TVA, one of my TVA nominees, but he did it publicly. So I put a hold on one of his nominees, and I did it publicly, and we worked it out. So there's nothing wrong with asserting our rights, but we might as well do it in public. And I congratulate the senators for making that effort. Senator Wyden and Senator Grassley have been working for more than a decade on that, as well as other senators. The step that says that if a bill has for 72 hours been on the Internet and filed, that we can't require the clerks to read it all night long. That's a very common sense proposal. I know it will be greatly appreciated by the employees of the Senate who have the job of reading the bill. If they had a chance to vote, this would probably be the bill on which they would like to have a chance to vote yes. So these are important steps in the right in the right direction about which we'll have a chance to talk more about today as the debate goes on. But I'd like to end where I began. What we need most in the Senate is a change in behavior in addition to this change in rules. We need to preserve the Senate as a forum for minority rights. We need to preserve the 60-vote requirement for major votes. That will force consensus. That will cause us to work together. That will build support out in the country for the result of what we do, because they can see that both Republicans and Democrats think, for example, that the way we've gone about trying to make Social Security solvent is a good way, rather than one side or the other just jamming through their partisan way. There's a reason why it's a good idea for this not to be a body that operates by a simple majority like the House does. I mean, the House can repeal the health care bill overnight. Bring it over to the Senate. That side says, let's stop and think about it. The House, if it's Democratic, can repeal the secret ballot in union elections overnight. And it did with its vote in the last Congress. But when it came over here, the Republican side said, let's stop and think about it. The American people are better served by having these two different kinds of bodies, and the Senate and the American people will be better served both by the rules changes that we're likely to adopt this afternoon, and especially by the agreement by the majority leader and the Republican leader, which I feel confident has the backing of almost all of us, that we would like to work in a United States Senate where most bills are considered by committee, where most bills come to the floor, and where senators most of the time have an opportunity to offer their amendments in debate. To be sure, there will be times when, if it's repeal of the health care, that side does everything they can do to exercise their rights to stop it. Or if it's repeal of the secret ballot in union elections, this side will do everything we can to exercise our rights to stop it. But that won't be the ordinary course of events if this works like we hope it does. So I hope that my friends on the other side feel good about what they've done. They haven't achieved everything they sought to achieve, but none of us, well, we rarely ever do, particularly in a body of 100 that offers by a consent of 100. And what they have done, I believe, in addition to the rules changes that we're likely to adopt, is created a window in which we had a good open discussion about the kind of place we wanted to work, the kind of Senate that we hope would serve the American people the best, and we've come to a consensus about a change in behavior, which I believe in the end will be more important than the change in the rules. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from New Mexico.
Madam President, I have a couple of unanimous consent